One of the Disney Studios' most beloved and cherished films is Mary Poppins, a wondrous blend of fantasy, music, and moral lessons that can be passed down to future generations. Mary Poppins was an enormous Oscar-winning hit for Walt Disney, and unsurprisingly there were a few attempts to recreate its success. The two most well-known examples of this were Bedknobs and Broomsticks and Pete's Dragon. Neither managed to capture the same amount of public attention and acclaim as Poppins, and yet, while they were flawed films, those two had their occasional charms. But which was the better musical fantasy? That's what I'm about to find out. The interesting thing is that while Bedknobs and Pete's Dragon were products of the post-Mary Poppins era, they actually started development well before Julie Andrews flew in with her umbrella. Mary Norton's books about Miss Price, a witch in training, were first published in the 1940s, and it did not take long for Walt Disney to buy the movie rights. He sat on the project for quite a while, and at one point Bedknobs and Broomsticks was considered a plan B if Walt failed to convince P.L. Travers to sell him the Mary Poppins rights. The Sherman Brothers had even started writing the songs, with Bill Walsh and Don Negrotti working on the screenplay, which is why Poppins and Bedknobs share a lot of the same creative team. Of course, Mary Poppins did eventually get the go-ahead, and Bedknobs was put on hold. In 1969, the movie was re-greenlit and was eventually released in 1971, with Poppins director Robert Stevenson at the helm and Angela Lansbury in the lead role. Pete's Dragon, meanwhile, first came to the Disney Studios in 1957, when an unpublished short story was purchased as a possible episode of the Disneyland Anthology series. The project stayed stuck in development hell for decades, being revived and then cancelled at multiple points. Pete's Dragon was revived again in the mid-70s, and even then the script went through many changes. Elliot the Dragon, for example, was originally going to be invisible through the entire film, except a single animated sequence. However, the animators felt the audience would be ripped off if they paid to see a movie called Pete's Dragon and didn't see the dragon. Legendary Disney animator Ken Anderson designed Elliot, while Don Bluth directed the animation, working around the clock to get those segments finished by the film's premiere. Story-wise, both Bedknobs and Broomsticks and Pete's Dragon are fairly simple in the plot department, with their runtimes extended by the many musical numbers that populate the pictures. Bedknobs takes an almost episodic approach in telling the adventures of Miss Price, conman Mr. Brown, and a trio of siblings. The movie mostly follows them as they go from one location to another in search of a magical spell. These are fun places to go to, but the story still feels thin as a whole. Even the child characters don't develop all that much, as the focus is primarily on Price and Brown. The older brother does stop being cynical and disbelieving in magic, but that's already resolved in the first act. With that said, Angela Lansbury and David Tomlinson are still charming and likable together, and they guide us along quite nicely. Pete's Dragon is primarily about the relationship between Pete and Elliot and how they grow accustomed to the town of Passamaquoddy. The thing I find most nice about the movie is how sincere it feels. I buy the friendship between these two, as well as the new bond Pete forms with a pair of lighthouse operators. I also like the idea that Elliot's purpose is to help children in need. Now, does this story need to be 2 hours and 9 minutes long? Not really, as something around 90 to 100 minutes would suit it just fine. The songs and musical numbers are what push the runtime upwards, and Pete's Dragon is almost wall-to-wall songs. Some of these numbers move the plot forward, while others do not, so your mileage may vary on which should have stayed in the final cut. These are all nice songs, with Candle on the Water, Brazzle Razzle Day, and I Love You Too being the strongest. I personally could have done without the songs from Pete's hillbilly foster family. Actually, I could have gone without the hillbillies entirely. Especially when there's already a solid antagonist in the form of the swindling Dr. Terminus. The songs in Bedknobs are great, and unlike Pete's Dragon, there's a bit more of a break between the numbers. It's hard to go wrong when you have the Sherman Brothers writing your songs, and they delivered some memorable delights for the soundtrack. The Age of Not Believing and The Beautiful Briny are the strongest of the bunch, featuring their trademark way with melodies and wordsmith. Portobello Road is also a great song, but it has a tendency of overstaying its welcome. The sequence originally ran 10 minutes and then was cut down to 3 minutes. However, even while watching the shortened version, it still feels like it goes on forever. It doesn't drive the plot and characters forward in any significant way and is a bit too repetitive. The highlights of both films do come from the animated portions. Ward Kimball directed the animated section of Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and it's one of the most fun parts of the movie. The scene when the characters are underwater is a charming sequence, and the football match between the animals, with Mr. Brown acting as referee, is also highly entertaining. Plot-wise, this part is primarily a result of the characters attempting to get a hold of a magical medallion, but it's mostly an excuse to see some wonderful hand-drawn animation. Tomlinson has some great interactions with the Lion King, and there's also plenty of laughs when he gets trampled on multiple times by the animals. This is where the movie sort of peaks, though. As for Pete's Dragon, the dragon is a solid feat from Disney's animators. Elliot was brought to life around the time a new, younger group of animators was starting to arrive at Disney, and as a result was one of the earlier credits for the likes of Ron Clements and Glen Keane. There are moments when the combination of live-action animation looks a little off, but it's worth remembering this was made about a decade before Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and the animators, as mentioned earlier, were on a time crunch. The special effects, when Elliot is invisible and causing disruption in the town, are quite impressive though. As much as I do admire the film's sincerity, I will admit it can occasionally run the risk of being a bit too silly. I already brought up my distaste for the Hillbilly family, but there are other points when the movie goes heavy on over-the-top comedy. Some of it works. Mr. Magoo voice actor Jim Backus has a fun role as the mayor, for example, but I'd also forgotten how much public drunkenness is in this movie. The main character trait for Mickey Rooney, for instance, is he's frequently on the sauce, and Red Buttons also goes to the bottle a few times. The result is the film really exploiting the whole drunk act routine. Bedknobs, meanwhile, has a strange tonal shift in the third act. Even when watching the movie as a child, this was the part where I started to zone out, as it takes on a more melancholy feeling when Mr. Brown decides to leave Miss Price and the children. The film is set during World War II, which is alluded to at the start and is the reason for the siblings ending up in Price's care. This eventually gives way to the magical delights and musical numbers, until the climax when Nazis show up. It is fun to see Miss Price use her witch powers against the Nazis, and the enchanted suits of armor both inspired and an incredible feat of special effects. Bedknobs and Broomsticks actually won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects, and was absolutely deserving. However, the sudden appearance of the Nazis feels abrupt, and the climax goes on for quite a while. I do appreciate that the movie ends with the war still going on and Mr. Brown going off to perform his military duties. It would have been quite something for the filmmakers to claim that their fictional witch character stopped the Second World War. So which film do I prefer? I think both have their fair share of strengths and weaknesses, but I'm going to say Bedknobs and Broomsticks. In terms of imagination, I do think Bedknobs wins out on that front, as I've always enjoyed seeing the various ways Miss Price used her magic throughout the film, and the special effects artists do a wonderful job of convincingly bringing them to life. The music is wonderful, the animated sequence is a delight, and Angela Lansbury and David Tomlinson are absolutely charming. I just think they could have snipped a bit more off, and it's hard for me to get behind the tonal changes in the third act. Pete's Dragon certainly has its charms too, primarily the central friendships Pete makes. There's a genuineness to the story it wants to tell, and some of the musical numbers are highly entertaining and expertly choreographed. But it does threaten to get a bit too corny and silly, and like Bedknobs, it could use a bit more editing to tie the narrative up. Both films are fascinating peeks into Disney attempting to recapture that cinematic magic Walt infused in the studio, and while neither are great films in my mind, there is a certain likability and the craftsmanship is high. Now let me know whether you prefer Bedknobs and Broomsticks or Pete's Dragon, and I'll see you next time.